Welcome back to the History of the Ancient Near East. I'm Justin Singleton, and I'll be your instructor in this second to last recorded lecture for the class. Well, in this lecture, we're going to attempt to discover Tarshish, that enigmatic city that Solomon sent ships to and where Jonah had intended to flee. Specifically, in our search for the biblical Tarshish, we'll look at the history of Phoenician exploration, colonization and mercantile progress, and a deeper look into the colonization of the West, including the settlement patterns and presence of craftsmen at those Phoenician settlements. Finally, we'll look at a possible site for Tarshish, including the dated pottery, radiocarbon determinations, and the fact that the site is both the earliest and the farthest from the Levant. Well, most in the Western world are familiar with the pejorative term Jezebel, a name no woman wants to be called. With it comes the connotation of trickery, bribery, an insatiable lust for power and blood, and shamelessness. Well, Jezebel was a Phoenician. Through the ages, the Phoenicians have been regarded as a people whose primary interest is commercial enterprise. And like Jezebel, they've been known as hucksters, cheaters, and swindlers. Fortunately for the Phoenicians, a foul image is not the only image in antiquity. In his Iliad, Homer writes of a Phoenician silver mixing bowl as the loveliest thing in the world, a testament to Sidonian craftsmanship. Herodotus tells us of the great learning of the Phoenicians who delivered the alphabet to the Greeks. Because of their economic prowess, the traditional belief concerning early Phoenician expansion into the West is one of a well-established commercial venture seeking the metals of the far West and trade along the shores, though this traditional view of mercantile intent is challenged by the concept of purposeful colonization. Either way, there's question as to the possibility of one particular passage concerning the Phoenicians, biblical passage, I should say, 1 Kings 10:22, which states that both Jerusalem, Solomon, and Tyre sent trade ships to gather gold, silver, ivory, and exotic animals. Now, the question at hand is whether or not Phoenician Emporia even existed this early. And if it did, where might this Tarshish be? Well, unlike other people groups in the area, the Phoenicians were, at least we think, the aboriginal, non-Semitic inhabitants of the land, the Hamitic Canaanites who escaped and pushed northward, at least we think, though the language itself is of Semitic origin. They lived in the land of Phoenicia along the Mediterranean coast with mountains around, somewhat secluded from the world. Now, it should be noted that the region of Phoenicia is home to several city-states, including Tyre and Sidon, but there never was a nation called Phoenicia. Well, as you've learned several times in this class, probably, around 1200 BC, at the dawn of the Iron Age, there occurred a great migration of different people groups that displaced other people groups who then in turn displaced others. The original cause is somewhat anomalous, but what entailed was an end to normal trade. The famous Ugarit and Alalakh saw their final days. The Sea Peoples attempted an attack on Egypt, and seemingly the entire Mediterranean world was in chaos. That is, except for Phoenicia, which suffered little. While Phoenicia appears to have been excluded from the multiple destructions, the end of typical trade did have a negative effect on the Phoenician cities, who, like others, relied on external resources to survive. Fortunately for the Phoenicians, the end of trade meant open trade, and with overpopulation at Tyre, the West seemed the perfect escape. Just a quick note, if you hear the ducks quacking, those are my ducks outside screaming at me. They want some bananas or apples or treats or something. So forgive me if you hear the ducks. Anyway, the geographical and climatic conditions of the Phoenician cities lent toward a shipbuilding industry, particularly the mountainous resources that surrounded the region and protected it from the outside. And with an already existent small-scale commercial enterprise that partially collapsed along with the major trade networks, and a growing population crisis, the outside world appeared to be the solution. Well, with the loss of Ugarit and other major trading centers, a Phoenician enterprise was now more than possible. And early trade with Cyprus, Egypt, and the southern Levant meant an already open market. Perhaps it was the coming of the Sea Peoples that opened the mind of the Phoenicians to trade farther west. But at a minimum, it was the Aegean influence in Cyprus that identified potential farther out. For whatever reason, we learn that the Phoenicians found it constructive to extend their reach quite far into the Mediterranean. As outside settlements developed, the Phoenician cities became quite rich, with settlements such as Carthage paying tithe to the temple of Melkart, or Baal, back in Tyre. These early sites were formed as small, unwalled settlements, often off the coast, like on a little island off the coast of the mainland, and with good harbor, allowing for the landing of ships that could deliver supplies and then return with goods from those outside regions. Now, it's important to understand the difference between Phoenician and Northern Levantine. For most, Phoenician is a term describing the Iron Age mercantile group with roots in Phoenicia, post the Great Migration period. This study is not really that interested in at least this lecture, is not really interested in a fully developed merchant fleet from Tyre, but rather with the beginnings of colonization, what many refer to as the pre-colonization period. Now, it's in this period that evidences of Eastern influences are seen, particularly in the Bronze Age. Dating to the late Bronze Age, a small deity figurine of Syrian influence has been found off the coast of Selanuta, which is quite far from Phoenicia. This figurine likely identified as the Canaanite or future Phoenician Resheph due to the conical headgear and the raised hand. While this early influence may not be termed Phoenician, surely the Levantine influence is due to Upper Canaanite trading with Cyprus, and therefore can be understood as at least the roots of Phoenician trading. Now, granted, this isn't evidence for settlement, but it is evidence for contacts. Well, the earliest attested date for permanent Phoenician settlement in Sicily, since we're talking about Sicily just now, is no earlier than the first quarter of the 8th century BC, and in western Sicily, long after the ships of Tarshish. Of interest, though, is the idea that these permanent settlers followed routes already well known from earlier late Bronze Age travels and exchanges. Perhaps these already known routes are those cited by Thucydides as Phoenician trading ports in eastern Sicily and all around the island. These early established sites are eventually abandoned in the late 8th century due to the establishment of the earliest Greek settlements and the threat that the Greeks imposed. The Phoenicians of those abandoned eastern Sicilian sites most likely gathered together at already established western Sicilian sites, such as Motia, around 720 BC. Thus, the earliest sites in Sicily could be dated prior to this Greek expansion. New settlement examples can be seen along the coast from Malacca to Abdera in Spain, and these match what Thucydides said of the pre-colonization sites in Sicily. namely that their location near a low coastal promontory and or on a peninsula at the mouth of a river evokes characteristics of the oldest Phoenician pattern of settlement geared toward commercial ends. One example from Sicily of an early site is Motia, established on an island rather than a peninsula, that dates to around the second half of the 8th century. Of importance to this island are the two port facilities, northeast and southwest. The original, relatively small settlement appears to be prime for commercial enterprise. Early non-permanent settlement patterns are also identified at Huelva, Spain, with the earliest attested phase containing multiple amphorae, a type of storage vessel sometimes used in trade over long distances, holding wine or oil, sometimes dry goods like grain, but usually stacked or hung in the hold of the ship, and taken across the sea. The predominance of amphorae within these oldest contexts substantiates the claim of early commercial exchanges with no stable Phoenician settlement of importance. Now, Huelva was an autochthonous Phoenician community with the presence of craftsmen early on. The most likely reason for permanent settlement in Huelva is reflected in the material culture found there: woodworking refuse and metallurgy refuse, and so forth, namely the settling of skilled craftsmen at the site. Something also seen at the earliest phases of settlement at Morro de Mesquitilla, Chorreras, and Tuscanus. I don't think I mentioned it in this lecture. Well, I did originally, and I took it out for purpose of time, but let me just note this anyway. Around this time is when the Assyrians start to really put pressure on the Levant and other people groups as well. And so some of these craftsmen, at least has been theorized that some of these craftsmen are attempting to escape, kind of like Dido tried to escape from the region and establish Carthage. The fictional person of Dido, but still, you get the idea. Well, key excavations at Huelva took place in 1996 in the form of rescue operations in anticipation of urban restructuring in the modern city. Due to groundwater, material culture beyond the 7th century was not reached. Once that groundwater was pumped out, excavations continued until virgin soil was reached. What was left between the 7th century material culture and the virgin soil was a thick, black, muddy stratum that acted as a separation from that above and the virgin soil below, thus establishing the oldest layers at that point of the site in one stratum. Material within this muddy layer ranged from pottery to stoneware and beyond. As is common within archaeological research, there was supposed to be an image there showing pottery dating. Forgive me, but apparently it just skipped over it. As is common within archaeological research, dating typically takes place from a well-established reading of the pottery. They can look at the pottery and say, okay, this is typical of the early Bronze Age. This is typical of the Middle Bronze Age, Late Bronze, and so forth. Forgive me that the picture kind of jumped away there. Well, in this case, Phoenician, Greek, Cypriot, Sardinian, Villanovan, and local pottery were collected. Unfortunately, the groundwater caused stratification to be completely illegible, as the layers within the groundwater became mixed, forming only one definable stratum. You've got to have multiple strata in order to understand how old things are. Well, when they're all mixed up, it's hard to tell. Obviously, this necessarily causes chronological problems. But as what's important to determine, for us anyway, is to determine the terminus post quem of Phoenician presence, and the virgin soil below represents uninhabited soil, a diachronic reading of the pottery isn't really necessary, at least for what we're doing here. Instead, one need only look at the oldest dated or datable pottery for an approximation. Unfortunately, as older pottery may have been reused at any given point in time, though this is probably unlikely in an Emporia-focused settlement, this cannot be used to determine exactly the age of site settlement. Well, the 8,009 pottery fragments cataloged from Hulva made up approximately 9% of the total excavated pottery fragments. Of these, 4,703 were of local handmade ware, stuff around the region in Spain, and 3,233 fragments were of Phoenician tradition, with minuscule numbers associated with Greek, Cypriot, and so forth. However, if focus is made on only diagnostic fragments, then the gap between local handmade and Phoenician ware virtually disappears. As this is a trading settlement, this is exactly what one would expect to find. This mixture of stuff coming in from the outside region and the stuff coming in from the ships. And as much of the Phoenician pottery appears to correspond with that of Tyre, one can be assured of the mercantile focus of the site. Concerning Phoenician ware, certain bowls appear to date to the beginning of the so-called Kitteian horizon of Cyprus, which dates to about 750 to 700 BC. But the majority of the fragments date to the so-called Salamis horizon, 850 to 750 BC, thus giving a date of not later than 750 BC, but possibly as old as 850 BC. Still too late to represent the Tarshish that Solomon sent ships to. Within the Greek pottery, earlier dates are found. Attic vases date to around 800 to 760 BC. But there are 3 fragments that appear to date to 900 to 850 BC. Now, there does exist a few Phoenician fragments from the so-called Kuklia horizon that date to around 1050 to 850 BC, thus giving us the earliest dates yet. The fragments consist of 1 jug fragment and 3 possible spout fragments. This gives an approximate date for the earliest Phoenician presence ranging from the very end of the 11th century BC to the middle of the 9th century BC, with a more reasonable assumption being the end of the 10th century BC or around 900 BC. While this alone at least approaches a date of Solomon, and any older fragments may have been destroyed or lost, radiocarbon dates of 3 bone samples result in a broad date range between 1000 and 820 BC. When calibrated, the date range drops to 930 to 830 BC, allowing for a date quite close to the historical person of Solomon mentioned in 1 Kings 10:22. Now, respectively, these bone samples date with a 92.9% probability to 930 to 820 BC for the first one, 95.4% probability to 1000 to 840 BC for the second, and 94.2% probability to 930 to 820 BC for the third. Of interest is the weighted average of the 3, 36.7% probability for a date range of 920 to 890 BC, and 31.5% for 875 to 845 BC, thus establishing the earlier date as the most likely. The earliest of the 3, GRN 29512, is given a 64% probability for 980 to 890 BC. Because of these radiocarbon dates, trade under Solomon is not simply plausible, but possible, and, in my opinion, inevitable. Now, while it's not possible to say that the earliest phase of colonization extends to this period, the earliest far-reaching site appears to be much, much earlier than previously thought. Indeed, this early phase at Hulva appears to have set the chronology for Phoenician expansion back much farther. While the pottery sequencing only allows for this early phase, the radiocarbon dating seems to determine such an early phase, thus establishing something of a difference between these two primary sources of interest. Though identifying Hulva with Tarshish is impossible, it's at least possible to confirm the presence of Phoenicians at a site that would likely take 3 years for a round-trip voyage. Additionally, the narrative of Jonah becomes much more meaningful when the prophet attempts to flee to the farthest possible distance away from God, going past even the Pillars of Heracles and reaching the Atlantic Ocean. Thinking of Jonah attempting to run away from God, if Hulva was his intended destination, there isn't much farther from Israel he could get. Of course, we know the story, and we know that there is no way he could have ran away from God anyway. As always, feel free to reach out to me if you need anything.